All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to virtual evenings with an author from the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager, zooming in from our Paris office with this lovely book behind me. Excuse me, I'm not very used to the Zoom screen. Tonight is such a pleasure to be in conversation with the absolutely brilliant Jen Silverman, who's a scholar of note with the American Library in Paris. So just a brief note about this conversation. We're going to be discussing Jen's fabulous book, There's Going to Be Trouble, and you're going to be discussing it too, because after about 45 minutes of us talking, I will hand over the reins to the questions that are in the chat, and we can do an audience Q&A as well. So please, if you have questions, send them in to the chat, and we would be delighted to answer them. I'm just going to let these last couple of people in the waiting room, and we'll get to it. Hello, come in. So, on to our brilliant speaker tonight. Jen Silverman is a novelist, playwright, and screenwriter. Their books include the debut novel We Play Ourselves, which was named one of the best books of the year by BuzzFeed, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award as well, which is an interlinked story collection, The Island Dwellers, which was a finalist for a Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, and the novel under discussion tonight, the brilliant There's Going to Be Trouble, which is this lovely cover right here, which is newly out from Random House. Jen's plays include Spain Witch, Collective Rage, A Play in Five Betties, and The Roommate, and they have been produced off-Broadway across the US and internationally. Silverman has also written on Tales of the City on Netflix, is writer-producer on Tokyo Vice Season 2, and is a three-time MacDowell Fellow, a member of New Dramatists, the recipient of fellowships for the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim, and is, of course, a scholar of note at the American Library in Paris. And the Scholar of Note program is really generously sponsored by the De Groot Foundation, so thank you to them. Jen, thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, and hello, everybody.
So we've got a small but mighty Zoom audience tonight. And Jen, we're just going to dive straight into it because I'm obsessed with this book and I've prepared a million questions for you, and I only have 45 minutes. And I want to get started just for those who are less familiar with the book and would like to know more about the characters, the richness of the plot, the different layers that it's operating at. We have two main storylines here, two streams that we're following. There's Minnow and there's Keen. And a small spoiler, these stories are related not only in terms of narrative coherencies, but in terms of blood relation as well. We learn that Keen is Minnow's father. And I want to walk through both of these narrative plots separately before we arrive at a point of stringing them together. So Jen, I'm hoping that we can start with Keen. I'd like you to tell us at the start of the book, when we first meet him, who is he, where is he, and what on earth does he want from the world?
I think he would like to know that question as well. In the start, when we first meet him, we're in 1968, and Keen is a graduate student at Harvard in Boston in the US, studying chemistry. And he is fundamentally apolitical in certain ways. I mean, he is really devoted to his studies. He is focused on science. He shows up, he goes to the lab. Outside, there's tear gas, there are protests, the student movement is underway in terms of the war in Vietnam. And as far as he is concerned, like, none of that really has anything to do with him. And very quickly in the first chapter, he meets and ends up sort of falling in a kind of tempestuous love with this radical organizer named Olya, who has been orchestrating a series of movements against the ROTC on campus, against like a whole other things. And she's also been protesting his advisor, who has, some linkage potentially with chemical weaponry. So we meet him in this moment, in which he thinks he knows what he wants, he thinks he knows what his world looks like, and all of that is about to change.
I love that you say that he thinks that all of this has nothing to do with him, because the crux of this novel, in a sense, is characters realizing that everything has to do with them, that they are in the world and the world is of them, and not only in the sense of political engagement, but in terms of familial engagement and love as well, personal, romantic. One is involved in these networks, these communities. I want to dive more into the specific community that Keen lands in, this group of sort of radical activists. Can you talk through their dynamics and what they're trying to achieve and where he ends up situated within this larger network of action.
Yeah, well, he gets to know Olya in part because without too many spoilers, he encounters her in a sort of a very heightened and potentially dangerous moment, and he by chance almost is a way for her to get out of that moment, and so she invites him to dinner, and then he starts to get to know her housemates. All of them live together in this big house in Brookline on Wellman Street, which is not dissimilar to a house in which I used to live in that exact area.
Really?
I mean, it was full. The house that I lived in was full of doctors and med students. It was not full of student activists, but
And was it
that
also,
area.
did you do the wiring and the plumbing yourselves as well?
We did not, for better or worse, but the ceiling did fall in on us one night, and then we had to move. So maybe if we had done some wiring and plumbing, we could have stayed there longer. I don't know.
Um, and so Keen, he finds himself in this group. At what point you say that he doesn't quite think that anything in the world really relates to him, that it has anything to do with him. At what point do things turn for him, if we're to believe that they really turn at all?
Yes. Well, I want to put a sharper point on that because I think, in a way, with Keen, it's not that he's fundamentally apathetic or disengaged. It's that the focus, the fulcrum of his engagement is science. He believes very firmly I should say, before I say this, I'm raised by two scientists. My father's a physicist, my mother was trained as a chemist. I have retained none of those skills. But there is something that really fascinates me in what I think is, or what I have perceived as, a way of understanding science as the sort of the one gift that humanity can give itself, where you contribute to a body of knowledge that is true, regardless of who you are and where you come from, regardless of what you believe and what you want, regardless of how human society and social contracts shift. You are contributing to a body of knowledge. This is sort of the ideal, right? You are contributing to a body of knowledge that does not. It can be developed further, it can be questioned, but it doesn't. If it is true, it doesn't change. And so you are interrogating a thing until such time as it is true, and then that knowledge is handed down generation to generation and improved upon. And this is something that Keen believes very strongly, and so he has sort of given himself and his sole focus to participating in this lineage, or this legacy, so to speak. And I think Olya really troubles that for him, because her focus is, okay, sure, science, pure science, but how is it used? Chemical weaponry, what are people doing with your discoveries? Like, you're doing this in the lab, and like, yes, I hear what you believe, but there is, for every scientific truth, there is a human application. And is that perhaps not also your business, essentially? And so I think he starts to ask real questions about what it is, about the narrowness of his focus, and the focus starts to expand in some ways. And I think the more that he gets pulled into Olya's world, the more those changes, and again, without any spoilers, but the more those changes play out in his own life in increasingly drastic ways. But I think we haven't yet gotten to Minnow, but for both Keen and Minnow, I think one of the things that is my focus, or that really fascinates me, is this question of how fundamentally apolitical people, I almost want to say, get radicalized, but that sounds perhaps even more drastic than what I'm talking about, although in the book it becomes quite drastic in both cases. But how people who do not define themselves by their politics necessarily, any of us can be pulled into a context for reasons other than ideology. And, right? Like, we talk about somebody having a politics, and we think about, oh, the ideas on the table, the intellect on the table. But also, it's like, who do we love? How do they speak to us? How do they make us feel? How do we find belonging inside circumstances that suddenly appear for us, right? There's something actually very human and very visceral about how we find ourselves embedded in any kind of politic. And that was what specifically interested me, without necessarily passing judgment on that.
Well, there's this really interesting tension in the book between being sort of political, being historical with a capital H, and then living, like participating in the human world of which one is a part. And in fact, what's so compelling about both Minnow and Keen is that they are living examples of the fact that living is politics or politics is living, and they think that their lives are distinct from the activity happening around them. And then, therefore, they almost consider themselves immune from it because they've chosen life
Mm.
over politics. And in fact, the two are wedded together in such compelling ways.
Yes, yes, I think that's astute, yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate.
And
um,
as you're and that's because what's interesting, I say that only because you articulated something that wasn't quite the way I was thinking about it, but actually I think
mm,
that's quite true and is present in the book as well, that
mm,
that
mm,
kind of assumed immunity
mm.
that then becomes challenged the more you start to pay attention to
Yeah.
what lies outside,
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, in a serious way, they become infected by politics. It enters their bodies. And with Minnow, we'll get to this, but there's an intensely erotic aspect to politics, as there is with Keen, actually, with Olia as
Yes.
well. Politics and sex come hand in hand in this book in sort of increasingly catastrophic ways, I would say. Um, I want to talk. I do want to stick to Minnow. I want to just probe Keen a little bit more because he's such a rich character. His status as an organic chemist, as you've pointed out, it allows us to probe this really fraught relationship between science and the advancements of human life. Something else that's really compelling about him is that he allows us to really, or he's very attentive to the performativity of politics, and he
Mm,
seems very, very conscious to the point of being self-conscious of adopting a role. So he's in these various tense political situations. Again, to avoid spoilers, there's an occupation of which he plays a role. There's a protest in which he sort of stands out. He performs exceedingly well, I would say, and yet a question one is continually asking oneself in regards to Keen is whether or not he fully believes the role that he is playing. So, do you consider him to see himself as part of the revolution, or is he always slightly, perhaps even ironically, exterior to or distant from it?
that's a good question. I don't think, given the size of his feeling for Olia and what he
Mm,
starts to find in her world, I don't think
mm,
that he's at a certain point capable of irony around
mm,
it. And
mm,
I think that the distance that he feels, particularly initially, is a distance that causes him some pain,
mm,
as opposed to
mm,
being a distance that he fosters. But I
mm,
think there's a moment in the book in which something happens. Well, actually, this is not a huge reveal, so I'll say it. But he's gotten a draft deferment, right? Because
mm,
he's
mm,
which many at that time, many students could get, particularly students who are get higher education, a higher degree. You could get a deferment
mm,
for a time. Um, so he's gotten this deferment, which I think has helped fuel that feeling that you called it immunity earlier, which I really like, that
mm.
the war is happening, but I'm in the lab.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then he receives a letter saying, your number's up.
Mm,
So now you have to respond to this to the office, and you have to submit yourself for the draft. And
yeah.
that I think is a moment in which suddenly what is political becomes intensely personal for him,
Mm,
intensely. And
mm,
what Olia and her sort of housemates and her colleagues, like what they have been protesting, sort of the place of the war on the college campus, the American participation in the war at all,
mm,
suddenly what they are doing is raising a voice in the middle of this sort of normalized militarized violence and saying
mm,
absolutely not, right? and
yeah.
and that
Mm.
voice, I think, at that starts to feel like like a lifeline for him, because somebody is speaking to a thing that
Mm,
suddenly,
mm,
deeply personally impacts him in a
mm,
way that he finds terrifying.
They're sort of voicing the absurdity of the world that he can't live in anymore. Like his world is broken, and they're the only ones saying it's broken or seeing that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to talk about Miss Minnow as well. So we have this one storyline, which is 1968, the Harvard campus, the protests of the Vietnam War, and then we have a second story, which is occurring as well across the book, and that's with our protagonist Minnow. And with Minnow, we see Keen once again, and we see a very different version of him. So can you tell us who she is and what her relationship is with this man, Keen, who has now become her father, a very changed. man.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so we meet Minnow in 2018,
Yeah.
and she has just gotten to Paris. She has had to leave the States. She was teaching at a private school, um, in a small town America, and something happened, which I will not
This is a
ruin.
book with so many things happening. I mean, there's
Yeah.
for those who haven't read it, it's so incredibly hard not to spoil it because it's just so rich in events and occurrences.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really interested sort of in these in these pivotal moments where something
Yeah.
happens and we are forced to confront our capacities,
Mm, mm,
in ways that we wouldn't perhaps otherwise. And
mm,
so, there are some plot twists, perhaps, I don't know if you call them plot
mm,
twists, but there are some sort of events that I won't spoil for you because
mm,
you sort of, it, it plays out in a particular way.
mm,
Um, but Minnow has had to, in the aftermath of sort of a scandal, and a scandal that has become sort of out of control and has become politicized in a way that she never imagined was possible.
mm,
A friend of hers who teaches at a university in Paris has to leave for a
mm,
semester and says, "Do you want to take my classes? Essentially, do you want to get the hell out of where you are?" And Minnow says
mm,
yes, and she goes. And so we meet her in this place where she is, I think, deeply questioning most of the choices that she has made, questioning, trying to wrap her head around what it was that happened back in America and her role in
mm,
that. And I
mm,
think really contending with, um, the blind spot that comes with that feeling of immunity, so to speak,
mm,
that it did not occur to her that the event she participated in could be politicized
mm,
and used
mm,
against her, because
mm,
it didn't occur to her that it was political.
mm,
It was her participation in it came from a very personal place, in aid of a student of hers, and so I think she is having to like rethink, um, the political and the personal, essentially.
mm,
And early within the first chapter, she finds herself in the middle of a protest. This is early. This is in the Gilet Jaune and the Yellow Vest protests that were happening in Paris that began in 2018 and continued from that point. So she doesn't have a lot of context for what she's seeing because it's a relatively new thing and she just showed up. But she is sort of fascinated by this mass street protest, this sort of
mm,
society wide shift that seems to be happening. And she finds herself, she finds herself in an increasingly sort of escalating protest, and she's pulled
mm,
out of it to safety by Charles, who
mm,
is a young teacher, at the same university. And
mm,
then Charles is sort of, um, extremely politically involved in
mm,
this movement, in sort of like class politics in France in particular, because he comes from a very wealthy family and a very powerful family. He has a
mm,
lot of, complex feelings about that.
mm,
And she, as we have Keen and Olia, she falls in love with Charles.
mm,
And I think, to speak to what you were saying earlier, I mean, in both worlds, in 2018 and in 1968, I think, yes, the political awakening and the sexual awakening are intertwined,
mm, mm,
just sort of deliberately and deeply. And I
mm,
think in both cases, a character is waking up. I used this phrase earlier, but waking up to their capacity. They're waking up to their capacity for desire, the capacity for engagement, and also sort of their capacity for political conviction. Again,
mm,
for better or worse, right?
mm, mm. And it's so compelling with Minnow. She's not just drawn into the protest. She's really, in my reading, she's bodily attracted to them. They call to her. She has to go towards them. There are multiple points, multiple protests across the entire book where she's given the option to turn away and she can't. And it's
Mm,
interesting that you're speaking to this book as an exploration of how people reach their limits, basically, like what it takes to get someone engaged and what the threshold is. And for Minnow, she's given so many options where she didn't have to cross the line that she crosses, and then she chooses to cross it, or something in her compels her to cross it anyways. And this also occurs sexually with Charles, who's significantly younger than her, and with whom she has some scruples about this relationship. She's aware that there's is a sort of hint of impropriety to it, and yet she can't quite turn away from the immensity, the pure attraction of what is before her, be that the riot or be that this beautiful aristocratic tortured French man.
Yeah, well, I think, yes. I mean, there's this question, right, of how we are magnetized, what magnetizes
Mm,
us,
mm,
and which is in every way, the other half of that is sort of, where do we come from? What do we lack, right? We are
mm,
magnetized by the thing
mm,
that offers us what we lack. And I
mm,
think in Minnow's case, you mentioned her father earlier. We meet Keen again as going
mm,
by Christopher now, which is his full
mm,
name. Keen was a nickname, and he is in a very different place than he was in
mm,
1968 in terms of, um, I think the conviction that change is possible has drained out of him. He has
mm,
seen a number of things that we don't realize until the end of the book, really, like what he has seen,
mm,
and participated in, and but those experiences have in every way shaped his desire to engage with the world, his feeling
mm,
that engaging with the world is a fundamentally unsafe thing.
mm,
Like, Minnow is raised to sort of like keep her head down and tend to her patch of earth, and
mm,
that in some ways Charles and Christopher rather has fallen back on immunity as protection, so to speak. Like, if you
mm,
just stay in your yard, keep your door closed, pay
mm,
attention to your own business,
mm,
the world is the world, but you don't, that's not how you live your life. And I think what Charles offers Minnow is a sense of, get out in the middle of it, right? And roll
mm,
up your sleeves and
mm,
wade into the fray and see what you
mm,
can do.
mm, mm,
And that, I think, is catnip in a way that Minnow can't turn
mm,
away from that.
mm. And I love that you use this word magnetism because there's also the magnetism of the protest movement of those bodies in that space. And insofar as magnetism is a response to what lacks, magnetism is also so easily radicalized. Like the next step
Mm.
after the magnetic pole is when you can't separate it anymore. You reach that threshold point past which so there's no return. And in a sense that happens to both of them. Although perhaps Christopher does pull himself back, but with
Mm.
with the cost. There's a sacrifice involved in his ability to separate himself from the movement to which he's become attached.
Yes, yes, yes,
Um,
yes, that's right. The cost is very specific, and in some ways, without revealing the ending, I don't know that it's a choice that by himself in a vacuum he would have made
mm, mm, mm.
or would have been able to make. Yeah.
And I do want to talk about the ending as well, without giving it away. Well, in a sense, I want to talk about your position as the author of this book, and we'll get back to the characters in a bit. But I'm turning to you now. There's what I sense to be an undercurrent of fatalism to the book. There's a specific line where I can't remember at which point it is, but it says later, after everything that was going to happen had happened. And in a sense, you're a dramatist. This book is tragic. These are tragic characters. They seem fated to play out the roles that they will play forever and ever on the same stage of history, which keeps repeating itself. So, do you think the characters are doomed, or do you think there's hope for them when they begin these tragic scenarios, or when the play begins, in a sense, when the curtains rise?
Right. Right. It's interesting. Of the many conversations I've had, no one has yet characterized the book as a tragedy. So
Really?
I'm fascinated by that. I don't necessarily think you're wrong.
Mm,
Um, but what I think you're speaking to is my own very deliberate sense that what I wanted to do is indicate, without sort of drawing a conclusion about it, is indicate the cycles, right, in
mm,
which we and our parents and grandparents and their, are the ancestral cycles, the cultural cycles in which we
mm,
find ourselves. And it's kind
mm,
of crazy because in thinking about those cycles and looking at the protests of 68 and I mean, I was in Paris in 2018 at the beginning of the
mm,
Gilet Jaune protests. I was back in 2019 when the subway strike was happening.
mm,
The I was looking at two data points, right? As
mm,
opposed to sort of trying to draw a headline about protest in general. But I was looking at these cycles, and there are many other cycles.
mm,
Um, and then the book came out, and now I'm in New York in the Columbia protests, and
mm.
like there's a way in which suddenly I was like, wait, there's a
We're
lot
doing it again, yeah.
happening that looks
Yeah.
very similar to the 1968 protests that
Mm,
I was researching. And I say this only in that, in noting the cycle, I can't help but think about the function of memory and cultural memory, and
mm,
how we, I think, often feel that we are reinventing a wheel as opposed to noting that we are on the same wheel that is going
Mm,
around and around. And I
mm,
don't know, for myself, I don't know whether every time we get back to the same place, it looks a bit different. That
mm,
change is incremental and cyclical. Change is not a chronological escalation. It is incremental and cyclical, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. If
mm,
that is true,
mm,
or if we are simply just repeating histories that we have not um, societally tasked ourselves with appropriately educating ourselves around, right? Like
mm,
I don't know. I don't know. And I think the book poses the question. I don't think it answers the question, or if it does, I don't know what the answer is, but I think it poses the question. And it's interesting because as I have talked to different people about the book, I find they are responding to that question in a series of different ways, right? In
mm,
terms of whether they see that the answer is we're back here again and it looks the same, or the answer is we're back here again, but it looks kind of different.
mm. That's so compelling that it's received such a variety of responses. I'm curious to know how others have responded to it or read it and spoken to you about it, this question.
You know, it's I had a conversation the other day with someone who I, for those of you who don't know me, which is probably everyone, I have to say I'm not an optimist. So I would like to foreground this statement with the headline, I'm not an optimist. I would like to be. I love optimists. I'm surrounded by them. I'm not one. And this person that I was talking to was saying this book is the most optimistic argument for hope and change and political engagement that they
Wow.
had read recently. And they were like, you know, which it was very generous of them to say such a thing. And they were very moved by it. And then also they were like, I didn't know that you yourself had such, you know, a sense of positive change being on its way. And I was like, that is coming from you, my friend. But but also that is your answer to the question posed by the book, and it's not the wrong answer, you know.
Mm-hmm. And the book is not necessarily pessimistic. It's quite dark, and I think
Mm,
it has a very like honest and open view upon the ways in which protests fail or the way that a political movement can consume itself in some way.
mm,
But that's tempered by the fact that, not to spoil anything, speaking in the most loose terms, things kind of turn out okay for some characters at some points in time. And in particular, there's one character at the end, and we learn that for this particular character, their sort of grand gestures at becoming history and assuming politics have perhaps failed, but they've achieved political empowerment on a more micro community-based level. So can you speak
mm.
to perhaps where we might locate optimism within the book and what different channels of political action are entertained over the series of events that take place?
Yes. Um, for me, the single most optimistic moment of the book that comes to mind is a moment in which uh we meet Olia again. We hear from her again. I'm trying to think how to say this so I don't spoil anything, but we hear
Just
from
say
her
it, it's
again
fine.
in 2018. She is living in the American Pacific Northwest.
Mm,
She has been off the radar for a long time. She comes back
mm,
and she's talking to Minnow
mm.
and over the phone, and Minnow is sort of asking her some really just like burning questions about,
Yeah.
you know, how do you do it? How do you get out of bed
Mm,
every day? And you know, and Olia tells her the story that there was this hiking trail, and this I should say, this is taken from my life. My mother was actually
oh, wow.
instrumental in this. There's a hiking trail that was going to be turned by developers into a parking lot, basically, in this small town. It was a place where people like walk their dogs and look at the birds, and it's really pretty and right by a wetland. And it's great, and it
Mm,
was about to be decimated. And Olia, in her telling, which and this is what my mother did, but Olia gathered a group of people in the town and protested and went to town hall and sort of refused to just let the developers have it. And then
mm,
the town actually bought the land and it became town land that would
mm,
not be developed. And Olia says, in her example, this is change. This is like,
Mm.
did I change the world? No. Did I rewrite American politics? No. But like, we can get out of bed and walk our dog down to the woods and walk through the woods, and it's not a parking lot, and that
Mm.
means something.
Mm.
And in the case of my mom, I was so blown away. This was when I was still in college, but my mom is, I think she wouldn't mind this characterization, is, very shy and very quiet, and not someone who is given to public speaking of any kind or public engagement in that way. And she stepped miles outside of her comfort zone.
Mm.
To engage a group of people and bring them together and figure out who has what skills.
Mm.
My mom was trained as a chemist,
Mm.
and sort of was able to do essentially, I mean, I'm getting the words wrong, but a soil analysis saying,
Yeah.
if you develop this land and if these pesticides go into the land, those pesticides will reach the town aquifer in this way, in this amount of time, and it will take this many years to get that poison out of the water that you drink for these following scientific reasons. I mean, she like
Mm.
did the math in a way that no one else could have done it. And then, she and the group that she had assembled figured out who could sort of articulate that message.
Mm.
In ways that people could hear both in the town and then also in the town hall. And
Mm.
that to me was a stunning example of someone who is not an activist, not an organizer, not an optimist,
Mm.
perhaps. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'd ask my mom how she would characterize herself, and that I
Mm.
won't put that one on her. But someone who, as a citizen, could see and address a very small and also very large injustice that was happening right under her
Mm.
nose.
Mm.
And it took a lot of time and it took a lot of effort, and she won. you know,
Oh, Jen, I'm
um,
so glad to know that that's based on personal experience. That's so lovely
that
to hear.
is,
Yeah.
yeah. That was my mom's experience, and that I
Mm.
witnessed and was really moved by. And so when Olia offers that,
Mm.
as is change possible, Olia, while we save the woods, like, to me, that speaks, I think, to the optimism in the book, which is grand gestures, grand historical gestures. I don't know. I don't know. We keep
Mm.
having to make the same ones, so I don't know.
Mm. Mm.
And yet also we keep being empowered to make the same ones. So maybe that's a good thing.
Mm.
But also there are small, concrete ways, granular ways in which we can affect change in our communities. And that, I think, is as lasting and as meaningful as the things that, make the headlines.
Mm. Mm. And is this, you mentioned earlier that one can view change as linear or circular, and I'd love to know more about what your vision of circular change is. Would you say that speaks to it, or what do you picture when you describe that?
I think when I say circular change, what I'm thinking about um, are the ways in which we find ourselves back in a similar moment in time, but perhaps we have better tools, perhaps we have better language,
Mm.
perhaps we have a
Mm.
more fundamentally just view of what we're trying to accomplish.
Mm.
Um,
Mm. Mm.
I think about like the student protests in 68, right, which we mentioned, as opposed to now. And there have been strides, of course. You think about like the population who is protesting, there is a different attitude in society, like
Mm.
toward queer people, they're
Mm.
like toward
Mm.
like the various civil rights movements
Mm.
alongside the Vietnam protests, like all of
Mm.
that was feeding itself. And of course, we are now engaged in this country, in the States where I am right now, in a
Mm.
series of protests. I'm not saying we've solved things. I'm just saying there's different language and different tools that are now being brought to these protests.
Mm. Mm.
And I will say, I think it's a bit facile to make a one-to-one. Like, I'm not trying to say 68 and now, same thing.
Yeah.
Like, I hear that language, I hear that rhetoric, and I don't find it convincing.
Mm.
But an example, I think, of cyclical change is to find yourself in a similarly laden political moment and yet have brought different tools to the table.
Mm. Mm. I want to talk more too about this idea of developing new language as it intersects with advancements in civil rights or in identity movements, because there's a set of secondary investigation across specifically Keen's storyline of what it means to inhabit ulterior identities at that time. So Ethan, for example, is a character who's gay, and that's something that Keen sort of confronts and sort of doesn't. And then Olia's sexuality is discussed later. There's many different forms of loving that are explored, many different models of relationships. And then, of course, sort of with Minnow, it's that doesn't necessarily fall away. I guess social class really enters into it then. Charles and Luke are quite different social classes. But for you, as you were threading these stories together, how did you balance engagement with what I would say is the primary burning political fire and then the sort of minor political flames that are sparking all around it, which have to do more with these interpersonal identity-based issues?
Yeah, it's as you're saying it, I'm like, oh yes, that's true. Like Peter is gay in the
Mm.
Keen storyline, and but I don't. I'm not a writer who writes from a place of issue. And so it's interesting, like, that we are having a conversation about the politics of the book, because the book engages, of course, very
Yeah.
deeply in a couple of ways with a politic, or a set of politics. But I'm a character-based writer. I mean, I come from the theater. I come
Yeah.
from, a form that is in many ways for me entirely character-driven. And I bring that focus on character to the novels that I write.
Mm.
So in some ways, I mean, I love an ensemble. I love a rich ensemble. I On stage or on the page, I'm interested in who are the people around the people that we're talking about. And so those people sort of just took form. And in terms of Peter being gay, I think it never, it felt clear from the beginning that that's who that character was. And
Mm.
it was important to me in writing it that it is news to Keen, who has not been around gay people. He's a straight man raised in a very straight environment in a moment of societal change where he's like come up from the lab, so to speak, and
Mm.
is suddenly realizing that there's a lot of lives out there that don't look like his, that for
Yeah.
him that's news, but that it isn't news necessarily for anybody else.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't function as a plot point. It functions
Mm.
as like a deepening moment of intimacy between two characters who are getting to know each other and who are starting to
Mm.
understand each other
Mm.
differently.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
that felt important. And I think just in terms of, I mean, to speak to sort of how the personal and political intersect for myself, like I'm queer characters, like we've always been here. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like we've always been
Mm.
here in ways that weren't about um our queerness. We just
Awkwardness.
live and exist. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I
Yeah.
mean, you and I think talked about this over coffee like
Yeah.
a year or two ago, but it's like we've always sort of been in the world,
Mm.
and I am interested in stories where that isn't necessarily the sole focal point of the
Yeah.
story anymore.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
don't get up every day and think about my queerness. I get up every day and I think about like,
The
okay,
work
this is
you
what I
have
have
to
to
do.
do, and this is the work
Yeah.
I have to do, and this is what's happening, and is it raining? Is it, so
Mm.
it's that I'm
Mm.
interested in sort of like, of course, my lens as a queer writer on
Mm.
my work is a specific lens, but
Mm.
not necessarily topically specific.
Mm, mm. I love the idea that it's not a plot point. It's a deepening of character. I love that you say that you're a character-based writer because I've so many follow-up questions to that I will ask. And while I'm asking them, I will say to our Zoom audience, please send your questions into the chat because we are going to switch to a Q&A in 5 to 10 minutes, and our chat box is quite empty. So get to thinking, get to questioning. And while you think, I'm gonna just keep interrogating Jen because I'm having so much fun. So Jen, you say you're a character-based writer. I'd love to know who was the first character of this novel? Who resisted you the most? Do your characters evolve as you're writing them, or do they arrive sort of, fully formed, fresh out of your head, like Athena from the head of Zeus? Tell us more.
Did you say who resisted me or who
Yes,
interested me? Who
both. I said
resisted?
resisted, but I like interested too, so I
Oh,
will take credit for
no,
that.
resisted is much better. I mean, Minnow was tricky to get inside of at first, but she was also the first character who showed up. And
Mm,
and she's tricky in a way because you are meeting her at a point of great change.
mm,
Um, and I'm interested in characters that you meet at a point of great change. I think a lot of my work involves those characters, but what is complicated is you haven't been there for all of the things that happened before the change, right? So in
mm,
some ways, in figuring out how to help an audience inside who a character is, like you're having to help them inside both who that person was, what they aspire to be differently, and where they
mm,
actually are, the sort of the failures or the successes inside that moment of transformation. But I
mm,
think characters who are hungry for change are fundamentally some of the most interesting characters for me.
Mm, mm,
Whether those changes are large life changes or small
mm,
incremental
mm.
changes.
And Minnow's just, I mean, she's amazing. She's terrifying. She's so unbelievably rich. She's just like the most decadent chocolate cake. There's this wonderful moment in the book where I can't remember the line exactly, I've written it down, but she says she's discovering for the first time that she can be dangerous. What an
Yes.
incredible thing to access through a character. I mean, walk us through discovering Minnow's danger.
I was really interested in, I could feel as I was developing the character and spending time with it, that this was someone who had been raised inside of a set of narratives around what an emotional life looks like. And since she's been
Mm,
raised by Christopher, who has
mm,
been, ever since we last saw him in 68, he's been suppressing a lot of things. She's
mm,
been raised with suppression
mm,
as a means of understanding emotional regulation, so to speak,
mm,
right? And I mean, not, I don't
mm,
want to get too intellectual about it, but that this is someone who has spent a lot of time being like, I'm fine, things are fine, I'm fine, things
mm,
are fine. And then suddenly things aren't fine. And that the understanding of that, or the sort of surrender to that, actually is intoxicating for her in a way that she didn't realize it
mm,
could be. That there is
mm,
a power in being like, things aren't fine. I'm not
mm,
fine. The society isn't fine. The thing that
mhm,
just happened isn't fine. The thing that I'm about to
mhm,
do is not going to be fine. But here we
mhm,
go. You know, like
mhm,
that once you get on that roller coaster ride, I think that she finds herself a bit drunk on it.
mm,
And I love that you call her terrifying, because I think that that is true at a
mm,
certain point. And there's a moment in which she comes face to face with
mm,
a sudden revelation about what she is capable of, and it, I
mm,
think, really frightens her,
mm,
because
mm,
there is, she makes a choice, and the choice leads to a consequence that she didn't see coming.
mm,
um but it was still her choice that led her to that consequence, and so I think
mm,
that in that moment she too is terrified of
mm,
herself. Yeah.
Excellent. We've got some questions coming in on the chat, so we'll turn to them, and then if people stop sending them in, I can be selfish and steal you back for myself and probe you even more about Minnow. But we've got some questions that have been sent through direct message to me, then we've got some in the chat. I'm going to start with just the first ones that I'm seeing. This is a direct message from Emma that I will share with the class. Emma has asked, what have you learned in creating characters in novels versus for stage versus for TV, and what are the difficulties that you've encountered for
Oh,
each?
that's a great question. I mean, I so much of how an audience meets a character has to do with the medium, as you just said.
Mm,
And so the tools of the medium are really how, what determine how you can let someone inside that person's point of view. And what I love about novels is the interiority is right there. You can hear
mm,
what someone is
mm,
thinking.
mm,
Um, in film, I really think a lot, of course, about what we're seeing, right? And the thing film can do that theater can't do is film can show you exactly what a character is seeing. All of a sudden, you're in their
mm,
POV, you're looking out
mm,
the window, you're seeing
mm,
the woodshed, you're realizing they're going to burn it down. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like that you can put someone aside their eyes. And in theater, what you have is both the intimacy of proximity. I mean, depending on the size of the theater and the space that you're
mm,
in, but there's a way in which the energy between an audience and a live performer's body generates
mm,
a kind of keen observation. You have body language, and then theater is really a medium of language. If film is a medium, a visual medium, which in many ways it
mm,
is, theater, you could sit for 5 minutes and you listen to a monologue and not feel like you suddenly didn't know what form you were in. Like in
mm,
film and in TV, if somebody's talking for longer than like 20 seconds, you really better earn it. There has to be a
mm,
reason. And there are many good examples of that, but they are earned by the material. In
mm,
theater, language is just so much a part of how an audience is brought into a story or transported, that you can
mm,
listen to a character talk. So I think
mm,
I think about all of those, like the different tools available when I'm thinking about what world the character is going to inhabit, and sort of how an audience meets that character on their own terms.
mm, mm. We've a second question as well from Emma. I think I was disappeared. Well, there was a question which I'm going to seize upon because it was asking about whether or not Charles would have been radicalized without Luke, and that reminded me that I've
Uh,
forgotten to really probe your brain about Luke. So tell us a bit about what role Luke plays in this book, and who Charles might be without him.
Yeah, Luke is Charles' close friend in Paris. He's older than Charles. He's a little bit of an older brother figure for Charles. He comes from outside Paris. He comes from a working class family. He is someone with very strong convictions, political convictions that he is living. And I think to Charles, there is something incredibly seductive about Luke's certainty, about the
Mm.
experience that it's based on,
Interesting.
the authenticity.
Yeah.
I think Charles sometimes he's aware that he is coming from a very privileged background, even though he is sort of shoulder to shoulder in the streets asking for a certain kind of change. But his father, for example, is like a childhood friend of Macron, the president,
Mm.
and he's very aware that like there is a complicity that his family, if not himself, has in terms of how the political stage is set, so to speak. And whereas Luke, I think Charles sees him as a much purer figure,
Mm.
and
Mm.
is in many ways is predisposed to believe what Luke believes and to listen to what Luke says until their perspectives on family are completely different. Luke has sort of
Mm.
cut ties with his for a number of reasons, and Charles is still sort of deeply embedded in his, though he and
Mm.
his father, of course, sort of clash all the time and disagree.
Mm.
Um, and so uh, at a certain point, Luke puts forward a plan that will inevitably involve and perhaps dangerously involve Charles' family. And at that point,
Mm.
Charles really resists Luke for the first time that we have
Mm.
seen.
Mm. Mm.
And so, sorry, tell me the question again. The question was, would Charles be
Be
who he is without?
radicalized without Luke.
Yeah, I I think probably given
Yeah.
his background and given his hunger to distance himself from his background, and also I think Charles' convictions are real. When he looks at the disparities around him, he's genuinely. I don't think his politics are a performance. I think they're very genuine.
Mm.
But I
Mm.
think that Luke, in a way, I mean, we fall in love with people, and those people mold us, right?
Mm.
And I mean, I mean platonic love, I mean romantic
Mm.
love, I mean
Mm.
familial love, all the kinds of love. When
Mm.
when you are vulnerable to someone in the best possible way, you are also a um, a vessel that they can fill in certain
Mm.
ways, right? And I
Mm.
think like this is sometimes how we change in the most positive ways is people teach us and form us and mold us, and also sometimes we change in the most sort of intractable ways, right? And
Mm.
I think Charles is formed by Luke very specifically in certain ways, and then starts to realize that.
Mm. Mm. We've got some questions from Amanda as well. Amanda says, "Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. For you and your writing process, how do you find writing for the stage differs from writing for a novel at all, if at all?" We've already kind of asked that, but perhaps if you have anything else to add about not just character-based writing, but writing itself for stage and novel.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I'll say, I mean, as something that I love about the theater, and I would say at this point as an artist, my practice is balanced, at least right now, fairly evenly between writing books, writing for the stage, and then writing TV and film.
Mm.
Um, I sort of move between those media.
Mm.
And something that I love so much about theater specifically, and then TV to a degree, though of course TV is different, is that it is a highly collaborative medium. Um,
Mm.
when I write a novel, I write the first several drafts, then my editor and I, of course, collaborate. But really, I'm sort of there's an isolation and a focus that I love. But in theater, what you bring in a draft, and then the actors are in the room and they have thoughts and they have questions, and you're really interrogating these characters together. And often an actor will have an impulse about how their character might do something that finds itself onto the page, or they'll have a question about a piece of dialogue, and then the line starts to change, and then you bring of course the directors in the process, sort of with you, but then you bring designers into the room,
Mm.
and as the designers think about the visual world of the play, of course that is going to impact what is on the page, how you world build, how the world shifts. I mean, an example, I had a play in New York last fall, that I had on the page, I had envisioned the world moving in a very particular way that, given the actual theater it was being produced in, the space and the budget and all the things, we couldn't sort of translate what the page directly to the stage, in terms of how things appeared suddenly, vanished suddenly. And so the set designer and I and the director had a real conversation about, what are we actually asking? What do we want the audience to experience? And the set designer ended up creating a revolve, which is where the stage turns. So what we were interested in were these moments where the audience doesn't see something and then suddenly it's there in front of them.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and so given the way that he built the revolve and he built the world, I started writing to it so that the audience, their attention might be over here and then they turn and they're seeing something, so there's a
Yeah.
way, this is a very long way of saying that there's a level of collaborative,
Yeah.
um, creation and thinking in theater that finds itself into the language, and which I sort of thrive doing.
But it's interesting you say that because on the one level there's collaboration, but then there's also sort of a need, uh, imperative for reactivity towards the world.
Yeah.
That you
Yeah.
are like the world is going to place things in certain ways, and then you have to position yourself in response to them. And that actually leads to Amanda's other question, which is how do you reconcile research and imagination when writing historical fiction? So when the world is your stage and the world is the theater isn't
Mm.
the way you think it might look, in the same way that the Gilet Jaune protests perhaps didn't shape up the way some might have envisioned they would have, or a way that might have better served the plot. How do you build your own little stages that whirl around when things get
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
escape fiction?
I mean, I will say I had never done it before until this novel with fiction.
Mm,
I've written screenplays for studios that were highly researched, that were set in
mm,
a historical moment. I worked on a Netflix show that actually didn't end up getting made, which happens a lot in TV. But
mm.
we were in that room for 3 months with a researcher who was
Wow.
bringing us research, and we were writing these scripts. So I've worked a lot with research, but not in this form. And it was really fascinating to me, that I had to sort of teach myself to foreground the narrative above all else.
Mm,
And because it's a novel, it's not a piece of documentary journalism,
mm,
it's not a
mm,
nonfiction essay, and so
mm,
with the 1968 stuff in particular, there's one sort of major occupation that happens, and I invented that. It's
mm.
taken from, and I say that there's a note at the end of the book, I think, which is very sort of clear about what
Yeah.
is not historically accurate. But it's inspired by a different occupation that happened at a different time in a different place on the Harvard campus. But I
Mm,
needed, for purposes of the story, I needed the occupation to sort of go down differently and to happen at a different time in
mm,
the season and all this other stuff.
mm,
And so I at first was trying to fit the story to the reality, and then I thought, like, this is a novel, like, we're trying to, there's a kind of truth that we are always trying for, but it is a narrative truth. It is a truth of
mm,
character. It is a truth of,
mm,
um, sort of not betraying the story for the facts, right? And
mm,
so,
mm,
that was ultimately a thing that I sort of retrained myself to do. But I
mm,
didn't want the audience to read the book and think that they were being served a history that wasn't true. And so the
mm,
note at the end was
mm,
important to me.
mm, mm. We have a final question from Miss Julia Kitts, who's several questions. Fantastic, thank you, Julia. Julia wants to know about the art on the book cover,
Mm.
why it was chosen. Start with that.
So this is the art on the book cover.
It's such a
Um,
sick book.
It's such a good cover.
Yeah.
It's by this designer, Rachel Oak, who I love. She's the cover designer for most of my books, actually, for all of my books with Random House. She did my novel We Play Ourselves, and the first thing I ever did was a story collection, The Island Dwellers, and she also did that. And what I love about this cover, she sent a few options, which were all excellent. She's just so good. But what I love about this cover is the sense of, chaos, right? Where you
Mm,
have, I don't know if you can see, but there's like the sort of the grainy newsprint quality of a protest at the bottom. You have this sense the world is melting, the world is changing, and then there's something like sort of classically European and this portrait of a woman at the top with her back turned, which is a reference. There's a moment in the novel where Minnow sees a portrait of Charles' great grandmother, who was, a radical in her time. So I think in some ways this is perhaps a
mm.
reference to that, or makes me think of that.
I
But
didn't realize that was the grandmother. I love that reading, that
well, that's
interpretation.
just my reading. I don't know if that was Rachel's. intention or not, but I looked at the cover and it felt like, in a way that I rarely see, the cover was managing to be both chaotic and extremely unified
Mm.
at the same
Mm.
time.
Mm.
So in some ways, it felt like the book to me, where there is so much sort of chaos in the book, and yet structurally, my intention was never for an audience to feel lost or to feel confused or to feel like they
Mm.
didn't have an anchor
Mm.
in the story.
Mm. And it does really cohere remarkably as a book. I mean,
Mm.
you've woven
Oh,
it
thank
with
you.
incredible skill. Yeah.
Thank you very
Um,
much.
and so Julia had a second question, which is the question that authors love to be asked, and I love to ask, which is, do you have ideas for your next novel yet? So tell us what you're working
Uh,
on, Jen.
yes. So there's going to be trouble as part of a 2-book deal with Random House. So there is a second book coming, definitely. And I am in the early stages of sort of thinking my way through it, but I'm really interested to write a thriller, which I've never done
Mm.
before as a novel. I've written screenplay thrillers, which made me super interested in the form, because
Mm.
there is something so delicious about a structure that takes care of you by catering to your curiosity in every
Mm.
twist.
Mm.
When it's done well, it feels like such a gift to be someone who is watching or reading a successful thriller. I find. So I'm thinking a lot about that, and I've been reading a lot of excellent thrillers. Christopher Bolin has so many good ones, but I was just rereading A Beautiful Crime, just so excellent. And of course, I read a lot of Highsmith. Shocker. Um, and Swan Huntley has a new novel out, which is also a thriller, which I was just reading, called
What
I Want You More.
what would you describe the form of the thriller to be? Can it be sort of formulated into A, then B, then C, or is it richer than that, perhaps more robust?
I think I'm interested in thrillers that are sort of texturally dense and robust.
Mm.
But like Christopher Bolin, I'm thinking about him in particular. He has so many thrillers that are like that are about the political context of the country in which they take place,
Mm.
and about sort of the multiple ripples under the surface of the culture that they're in.
Mm.
But also there is um, a sort of a twisty turny roller coaster quality to what a character is, the journey the character is going on through that, and so you plug
Mm.
into that journey, and then I was reading, oh, I'm not going to think of the name of it, it's on my shelf. It
I
takes
was
place in Cairo.
yeah, okay.
And it has to do with weapons manufacture, and
Mm.
someone goes missing, and so I'm like learning all this stuff about sort of like the black market weapons trade, while also following this character on this very pulse pounding journey. So I
Mm.
think I am interested in thrillers that in no way sacrifice character or texture,
Mm. Mm.
and that in some
Mm.
ways thrive on character and texture, but the container itself is doing something that I don't otherwise try to do in books, which is um, plug into an engine that just escalates, right? That there's
Mm.
and when I'm reading a book that just sort of like that book starts to floor it and the car goes
Yeah,
faster, it's like all I want to do is read it. I don't want to do anything else I'm
yeah,
supposed to do. I just want to read it. And that's
yeah.
I'm looking to sort of replicate the sort of
Mm.
the joyous obsession of that.
Mm. 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 Well, Jen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight about your brilliant book. Remind us once more what the book is called, where it can be purchased, and what else we should be looking out for from you in the near future.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. The book is called There's Going to Be Trouble. It can be purchased anywhere in the US, including Amazon, but also local indie bookstores. I love them. We want them to
Mhm.
survive.
Yeah.
Let us all order all of our books from indie bookstores, or libraries. We can go to
Mm.
libraries. And coming up next, I have, for anyone who's in the States, I have a play opening on Broadway in September called The Roommate. So you're in the city, feel free.
It's just so exciting, Jen. You're doing such remarkable things, and it's such a pleasure to be a part of your journey, having you as a scholar of note. Thank you again to the Group Foundation for sponsoring that program, which is what put us in touch in the first place, and we just cannot wait to see what you do next. So congratulations on this remarkable book. Thank you so much, everyone who joined us online. I hope to see you all soon at Evenings with an Author. And Jen, we must bring you to Paris and see you there. And if not, everyone will flock to the theaters to see your beautiful play. So have a lovely evening or day or morning,
Thank
wherever you are in the
you.
world.
Thank you so much.
We'll see
Thank
you
you,
on this.
everyone.
All
Take
right.
care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.